For 2,000 years, a civilization fed millions of people from land that modern agronomists would have written off before the first seed hit the ground. Rocky, thin, seasonally bone dry, then violently flooded. No temperate zone, no deep topsoil, no mechanized irrigation. And yet, the classic Maya didn't just survive that landscape, they engineered it into one of the most productive food systems the ancient world ever produced. Archaeobotanists working sites from the Yucatán to the Guatemalan highlands have spent decades trying to understand how they did it. The answer they found wasn't a single crop. It wasn't a clever irrigation trick. It was an entire architecture of growing, a layered living system that worked with soil biology instead of fighting it, a system so sophisticated that when Spanish colonizers arrived and dismantled it, it took the land roughly 4 centuries to recover. And the part that should make every gardener sit up straight, the core principles of that system work in Zone 4 clay as well as they work in Zone 10 sand, because they were never designed around a specific climate. They were designed around a specific relationship between roots, fungi, canopy, and time. Stay with this, because what I'm about to walk you through will change how you think about every square foot of ground you're trying to grow food in. And I mean that, without exaggeration. The first thing you need to understand is that the Maya forest garden, and what researchers now call the milpa-plus or home garden complex, was not a garden in the way we use that word today. It wasn't rows, it wasn't beds, it wasn't a cleared patch with plants inserted into it. It was a managed forest. Specifically, it was a forest organized into 5 distinct vertical layers, each one performing a function that supported every other layer. At the top, tall canopy trees, ceiba, breadnut, and ramon, whose deep roots pulled minerals from bedrock and whose leaf litter built topsoil from the surface down. Below that, a mid-canopy of fruit trees, cacao, avocado, papaya, whose broad leaves moderated temperature and humidity at ground level. Below that, a shrub layer of chili, achiote, and medicinal plants. Below that, ground-level crops, squash, sweet potato, amaranth, whose sprawling leaves suppressed competing weeds and locked moisture into the soil. And below all of that, working underground, root crops, tubers, and a web of fungal networks that the Maya almost certainly didn't have a scientific name for, but absolutely understood how to cultivate. The result was a system that generated its own fertility. Canopy leaf litter decomposed into topsoil. Root exudates fed soil fungi. Fungi extended the reach of every plant's root system. Shade-tolerant crops grew beneath sun-loving ones. Nitrogen-fixing legumes wove through the whole structure like a living fertilizer network. Modern permaculture practitioners will recognize this as a food forest. And they're right. The food forest concept, popularized in the West in the 1980s and 90s, is essentially a rediscovery of what the Maya were doing at scale more than 1,500 years ago. Here's what permaculture literature often glosses over, though. The Maya version wasn't just mimicking forest structure, it was actively managing succession. They weren't planting a forest and walking away. They were making deliberate decisions about which species to allow, which to remove, and when, decisions driven by generations of accumulated observation about how each plant affected its neighbors. That distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to replicate this system today. And we're going to get into exactly how to do that. But first, you need to understand why this system works in soils that should, by every conventional measure, be incapable of supporting serious food production. Drop a comment right now. What growing zone are you in, and what's the biggest soil challenge you're fighting? I read every single one, and your zone literally shapes what I prioritize next. Here's the part that most gardening content completely skips over, and it's the part that explains everything. The Maya forest garden didn't work despite poor soil. It worked because of what poor soil, left undisturbed and layered with organic matter, eventually becomes. The mechanism is mycorrhizal fungi, specifically arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the kind that form intimate partnerships with roughly 80% of all land plant species, including almost every food crop you're likely to grow. Here's how the partnership works. Plant roots release carbon-rich sugars into the surrounding soil. Mycorrhizal fungi consume those sugars and, in exchange, extend microscopic filaments called hyphae outward into the soil, sometimes several feet beyond the root tip, and ferry back phosphorus, zinc, copper, and water that the root itself could never reach. The plant gets nutrients, the fungus gets energy. Both thrive. The critical detail: this exchange only works when the soil is not being disrupted. Tilling destroys fungal networks. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizers suppress them, because when nitrogen is abundant, plants stop feeding the fungi and the network collapses. Fungicides obviously kill them directly. The Maya didn't till. They didn't apply synthetic nitrogen. They didn't use fungicides, not because they lacked the technology, but because their system was built around preserving the underground network that made everything above ground possible. What this means for gardeners in rocky, sandy, clay-heavy, or nutrient-depleted soils is profound. The soil you have right now is not the permanent constraint you think it is. It's a starting point. The Maya forest garden system builds soil biology from the top down, through mulch, through root exudates, through the slow accumulation of organic matter. And the mycorrhizal network does the heavy lifting of nutrient transport in the meantime. Researchers studying traditional Maya home gardens, still in operation in the Yucatán Peninsula, have documented extraordinary plant diversity and productivity in soils that, by standard agronomic analysis, should support almost nothing. The soil chemistry is poor. The biology is extraordinary. That's not a coincidence. I've put together a companion guide that goes deep on mycorrhizal inoculation protocols for different soil types, including which commercial inoculants are worth the money and which are marketing nonsense. That's in the resource library. The link is in the description below. But let's keep moving, because the mycorrhizal engine is only one piece of this. Most people who know anything about indigenous American agriculture know the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash planted together. Corn provides structure for the beans. Beans fix nitrogen. Squash shades the ground, suppresses weeds, and retains moisture. It's taught in every elementary school unit on Native American culture. What almost nobody teaches is that the three sisters was a foundation, not a complete system. In the Maya context, it was the annual layer of a much larger perennial architecture. The corn, beans, and squash grew in the gaps between fruit trees. The fruit trees grew beneath the canopy. The canopy fed the soil. The soil fed the fungi. The fungi fed everything. The Maya also incorporated what modern agroforestry researchers call useful weeds. Plants that most Western gardeners would pull immediately, but that the Maya recognized as performing specific functions. Chaya, for example, a leafy shrub native to the Yucatan, is one of the most nutritionally dense plants in the Americas. It fixes no nitrogen and has no particular mycorrhizal benefit, but it produces edible leaves year-round in conditions that would kill most vegetables, and its deep roots break up compacted subsoil. The Maya kept it at the edges of their gardens not because they couldn't get rid of it, but because they understood what it was doing. This is the mindset shift that makes or breaks anyone trying to apply this system outside the tropics. You are not managing plants. You are managing relationships. Every species in your garden is either contributing to the system's function or it isn't. The question isn't, does this plant produce food? The question is, what does this plant do for everything around it? That reframe alone, from producer to participant, is what separates a garden that exhausts itself after 3 seasons from one that gets more productive every year. And here's the part that should genuinely excite you if you're growing in a challenging zone. The species change, but the architecture doesn't. You don't need ceiba trees and cacao. You need tall nitrogen-cycling canopy species, mid-level fruit producers, nitrogen-fixing shrubs, ground cover mulchers, and deep-rooted subsoil breakers. In Zone 5, that might be black walnut, apple, gummy berry, comfrey, and daikon radish. The Maya logic applies perfectly. The plants are just different. If that concept, adapting Maya layer logic to your specific zone, is something you want a full blueprint for, the guides in the resource library break it down by climate zone. Link is in the description, but there's a specific technique inside this system that nobody talks about, and it's arguably the most powerful piece of all. What you've just heard about mycorrhizal networks and layered architecture, that's the foundation most people never get. Most gardening content jumps straight to plant this, water that, without ever explaining why the system works. And without the why, you're just copying steps without understanding the logic, which means the first time something goes wrong, you're lost. If this depth of explanation is what you've been missing, that subscribe button is right there, because this is exactly what we do here every single week. We don't do surface-level gardening tips. We go into the biology, the history, and the practical mechanics that actually explain why some gardens thrive and others don't. And what's coming next? It's the technique that even most permaculture practitioners get wrong, a specific soil-building method the Maya use that modern researchers have only recently begun to understand. It works in any zone, it costs almost nothing, and it can transform genuinely dead soil into productive ground in a single growing season. Here's the technique that changes everything. Beneath many classic Maya agricultural sites, archaeologists have found unusually dark, carbon-rich soil layers that don't match the surrounding geology. For a long time, this was attributed to accumulated organic waste, kitchen scraps, ash, general refuse. But more detailed analysis revealed something more deliberate. These layers contain high concentrations of stable charcoal particles created through the controlled, low-oxygen burning of woody biomass. The Maya were making biochar, and they were incorporating it into their garden soils on a significant scale. Biochar is not fertilizer. This is the most important thing to understand about it, and it's where most people go wrong. Biochar does not feed your plants directly. What it does is create a permanent, porous habitat for the microbial and fungal life that feeds your plants. Each piece of biochar is riddled with microscopic channels and chambers, surface area that, at the microscopic scale, is enormous. Soil bacteria colonize those chambers. Mycorrhizal fungi thread through them. Nutrients bind to the charged surfaces and stay in the root zone instead of leaching downward with rain. The stability of biochar is what makes it genuinely remarkable. Organic compost is wonderful, but it mineralizes, it breaks down, and its benefits dissipate over a few seasons. Biochar, once incorporated into soil, remains structurally intact for decades, sometimes centuries. The Maya soils showing those dark carbon layers are still measurably more fertile than surrounding soils today, more than 1,000 years after they were amended. For gardeners in sandy soils that drain nutrients as fast as you add them, or in clay soils that suffocate roots with compaction, biochar addresses both problems simultaneously. In sand, it creates binding sites that hold nutrients and water. In clay, its porous structure improves aeration and drainage while still retaining moisture. A critical note here, because experienced growers will rightly push back if I don't say this, raw, uncharged biochar can actually temporarily reduce plant-available nutrients when first added to soil, because the empty pore spaces absorb nutrients before microbial life has colonized them. The Maya almost certainly solved this the same way modern practitioners do, by charging the biochar first, either by composting it with organic material or by soaking it in diluted liquid fertilizer before incorporation. Raw biochar into bare soil is a beginner mistake. Charged biochar into an established system is a soil transformation. Have you ever tried making or using biochar? Drop a 1 in the comments if yes, a 2 if you've heard of it but never tried it, and a 3 if this is the first time you're hearing about it. I genuinely want to know where this community is starting from. The Maya grew food in a climate that oscillated between months of drought and months of torrential rainfall. Their forest garden system had to handle both extremes without irrigation infrastructure in most areas, and it did through a combination of physical soil architecture and biological water retention that modern gardeners can replicate almost exactly. The first technique is mounding. Maya agricultural sites frequently show evidence of raised planting mounds with depressed pathways between them. During heavy rain, water flows into the pathways and slowly percolates into the surrounding soil rather than running off the surface. During dry periods, the elevated mounds drain freely while the pathway soil retains moisture that wicks laterally into the root zone. It's passive water management that requires no maintenance and no infrastructure beyond the initial earthwork. The second technique is mulch depth. Not the thin layer of wood chips most gardeners apply. The Maya maintained ground cover so deep and continuous that soil temperature at root level barely fluctuated between seasons. Modern research on traditional Maya home gardens has documented mulch layers up to 30 centimeters deep, nearly a foot of decomposing organic material that acts simultaneously as insulation, moisture retention, weed suppression, and slow-release fertility. This is where the canopy layer earns its place in the system even for gardeners who primarily want annual vegetables. Canopy trees generate leaf litter. Leaf litter becomes mulch. Mulch becomes the biological buffer that makes the whole system drought resilient. If you remove the canopy because you think the shade is hurting your vegetables, you're removing the water management system. The third technique is the strategic use of deep-rooted plants as biological pumps. Plants like comfrey and its Maya zone equivalent, chaya, send roots down 2 to 3 meters into subsoil, accessing water that shallow-rooted vegetables can't reach. When those deep roots die back or are cut and left on the surface, they create vertical channels that allow surface water to penetrate deeply rather than running off. The Maya use specific plants in specific positions for exactly this hydraulic function. Now, a fair counterpoint, comfrey is a powerful tool, but it contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids that can be problematic in very high long-term doses for both humans and livestock. The Maya used it as a system component, as mulch and a soil builder, not as a primary food source. If you're growing comfrey for chop-and-drop mulch in your forest garden, you're using it correctly. If you're planning to eat it daily as a vegetable, that's a different conversation. Rotation and function matter. Here's where the Maya system becomes genuinely sophisticated in a way that modern gardening almost never addresses. Western horticulture thinks about succession planting as a time management trick. Plant lettuce every 2 weeks so you don't get a glut. That's useful, but it's not what the Maya were doing. Maya succession planting was ecological. It was about managing the transition between different biological states of the garden itself, from bare, disturbed ground, through annual crop production, through perennial establishment to mature forest garden, as a continuous, intentional cycle. When a section of Maya forest garden was cleared or disturbed by storm damage, by harvesting a mature tree, by the natural death of a canopy species, it wasn't replanted with whatever was most convenient. It was planted with a specific sequence of species designed to rebuild the layered structure as quickly as possible. Fast-growing nitrogen fixers went in first to rebuild soil fertility. Then pioneer fruit species that tolerated open sun. Then the shade-tolerant understory species that needed the pioneer canopy before they could establish. Then, eventually, the long-lived canopy species that would anchor the system for generations. This is succession management, and it means the Maya gardener was always thinking in multiple time horizons simultaneously. What this patch needs this season, what it needs in 5 years, and what it needs in 50. For modern gardeners, this is the hardest mental shift to make because we've been trained to think in annual cycles. You plant, you harvest, you clear, you replant. The Maya system asks you to think about what you're planting today as infrastructure for what you'll harvest in a decade. That sounds daunting, but in practice, it's as simple as this. Every time you plant an annual crop, also plant one perennial that will eventually shade, feed, or support that annual's successors. One nitrogen-fixing shrub, one fruit tree, one deep-rooted mulch plant. Do that consistently, and within 3 to 5 years, your garden begins to behave like a Maya forest garden, generating its own fertility, managing its own moisture, and becoming more productive with less intervention every single season. If you're serious about mapping out a succession plan for your specific space and zone, the companion guides in the resource library include zone-specific succession templates. The link is in the description below. It's the fastest way to take everything we're covering here and turn it into a working plan for your actual garden. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés and his forces moved through Mesoamerica, the Spanish chroniclers who accompanied them recorded something they struggled to describe. They had words for fields and orchards and kitchen gardens. They didn't have words for what the Maya had built because it didn't fit any category they knew. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier who wrote one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the conquest, described entering settlements surrounded by what he called gardens like forests, productive spaces that looked wild but were clearly managed, producing food at a density that seemed impossible to ease trained on European monoculture agriculture. What happened next was one of the most consequential agricultural destructions in human history. The Spanish colonial system required cleared land for cattle ranching and monoculture cash crops, cacao, indigo, sugar. The forest garden system, which depended on its layered structure to function, couldn't survive conversion to pasture. When the trees came down, the mycorrhizal networks collapsed. When the networks collapsed, the soil biology died. When the biology died, the thin tropical soils eroded within a generation. The Maya people didn't lose this knowledge entirely. In remote areas of the Yucatán, Belize, and Guatemala, traditional home garden practices survived, maintained by communities that the colonial economy never fully penetrated. Ethnobotanical researchers working with those communities in the latter half of the 20th century documented gardens that were, structurally and functionally, direct continuations of the classic Maya system. This is why the word forbidden in how we frame this system isn't hyperbole. It wasn't forbidden by law in most places. It was forbidden by economic structure, by a colonial agricultural model that required monoculture because monoculture was controllable, taxable, and exportable in ways that a self-sufficient forest garden never could be. The Maya forest garden was incompatible with the plantation economy, so it was dismantled wherever the plantation economy reached. What survived did so because it was hidden in plain sight, in the home gardens of rural communities that colonial administrators considered too small and too informal to bother regulating. And that's exactly where the knowledge waited for 4 centuries, until researchers finally started paying attention. The survival of this knowledge against those odds is, honestly, one of the most remarkable stories in agricultural history. And the fact that it's now being studied, documented, and adapted by growers in every climate zone on Earth feels like a kind of justice. Everything we've covered, the 5 layers, the mycorrhizal engine, the biochar, the water management mounding, the succession logic, it can feel overwhelming when you try to hold it all at once. So let's make it concrete. Here's how you actually start. This isn't a weekend project. The Maya Forest Garden is a multi-year investment in a system that pays compound interest. The first season, you're planting infrastructure. The second season, you're seeing the first returns. By year 3, the system is visibly different, more productive, more resilient, requiring less input in ways that will make you wish you'd started 5 years ago. Be honest with yourself right now. How many growing seasons have you spent fighting your soil instead of building it? Drop your answer in the comments, because that number, that's the cost of not knowing this system, and it doesn't have to keep going up. If you've made it this far, you're not a casual gardener. You're someone who wants to understand the why behind the what, and that's exactly the kind of grower this channel exists for. Everything we've covered today, the 5-layer architecture, the mycorrhizal engine, biochar charging, succession logic, water management mounding, that's the conceptual framework. The practical implementation, broken down by growing zone, soil type, and available space, is what the guides in the resource library are built around. If you want zone-specific plant lists, succession templates, and biochar protocols you can actually follow, the link to the full library is in the description below. And subscribe, because next week we're going deeper into the specific species that perform each layer function in temperate and arid zones, with yield data that will genuinely surprise you. The kind of content that takes real research to produce, and that you won't find packaged this way anywhere else. You came into this video thinking about soil and zones and climate. You're leaving it understanding something different, that the constraint was never the soil. It was the architecture. The Maya knew that 2,000 years ago. Now you do too. Thanks for watching. The end screen has more videos in the same world. Thanks for being here. Pick whichever video on the end screen calls to you.